when a half-frozen German Shepherd puppy with black and tan fur limped out of a brutal Montana snowstorm, a weary police officer on night patrol thought he was simply helping a lost animal. But the moment his flashlight hit the puppy's trembling jaw, he froze. Clamped between its teeth was a burnt scrap of red fabric, from the same evidence locker fire that had killed his closest partner months before. The mystery deepened into terror when he scanned the puppy's collar and uncovered a hidden military-grade tracker sealed inside. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't even a rescue. Someone had sent the terrified puppy straight to his door, leading him and his 7-year-old daughter into the center of a deadly trap. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support truly means the world to us. And tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Ikostörst. Redwood Crest was a quiet mountain town, tucked against the northern ridges of Montana, a place where winter storms rolled in with the weight of legends and the kind of bone-deep cold that carved its way through pine forests and roof shingles with equal mercilessness. On this particular night, however, the storm felt angrier than usual. The wind screamed against the wooden siding of the Hale cabin, rattling the shutters as if demanding entrance, while curtains of white snow erased the winding road leading up the hill. It was nearly midnight, and the world outside looked like a churning ocean of ice. Inside the cabin, Officer Mason Hale tried his best to pretend life was normal for the sake of his daughter. Mason was 42, broad-shouldered, tall, and built like a man who spent years wrestling violent suspects into patrol cars. His short, dark brown hair was sprinkled with early gray at the temples, and the grooves around his blue-gray eyes were deepened by too many sleepless nights. He had a quiet, steady way of carrying himself, calm, deliberate, dependable, and yet grief had carved a hollow behind his gaze that hadn't left since the fire last year. He wore his dark navy police patrol pants and a coal blue thermal shirt, not because he needed the uniform tonight, but because he preferred its weight. It made him feel anchored when the world around him had lost all shape. Across the living room, his daughter sat curled on the braided rug near the stone fireplace. 7-year-old Chloe Hale was small and bright-eyed, with soft blonde waves that fell to her shoulders and a face like winter sunlight, gentle but capable of fierce brilliance. Since the death of her mother in the evidence warehouse fire last winter, she had become quieter, sticking closer to Mason as though afraid he might disappear too. She wore her usual bright red wool coat with oversized wooden buttons, her favorite garment, one she insisted on even inside the house whenever storms rolled in. The color made her feel braver, she always said. Mason watched her as she traced shapes in the fogged window pane, humming to herself in a trembling little voice. He wished he could make everything easy for her, but the world had not been kind lately. Thunder rumbled across the valley, a rare and unsettling sound during a snowstorm, and Chloe flinched. Mason rose from the sofa, intending to reassure her, when something outside shifted. A flicker of dark motion crossing the floodlights near the edge of the porch. At first, he thought it was just drifting branches. Then the shape staggered, limped. He froze. Animals didn't usually wander the ridge during storms, not unless they were desperate or wounded. Slowly, Mason approached the window. The wind whipped a spray of ice against the glass, and through that chaotic blur, he saw it clearly. A dog. A German Shepherd puppy, maybe 7 or 8 months old, thin as a shadow, its black and tan fur soaked flat against its trembling body. Its left hind leg was swollen, dragging at an unnatural angle, and its ribs showed through its wet coat with heartbreaking sharpness. The animal's head hung low, but in its jaw, clenched like a last lifeline, was a scrap of bright red fabric, burnt at the edges. Mason's breath thinned. There was only one place he had ever seen that exact shade of fire-scorched red: the evidence warehouse where Brian Whitaker, his closest friend and patrol partner of 12 years, had been trapped and killed last winter. That fire had taken more than Brian. It had taken Mason's sense of direction, his belief that justice had order and reason. And now, a puppy was limping toward his doorstep, carrying the same color that haunted his nightmares. "Dad?" Chloe whispered, sensing his stillness. Mason snapped back, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Stay inside, sweetheart. I need to check something." He pulled on his dark navy winter police jacket and stepped outside. The cold slammed into him instantly, a violent wall of needles. Snow swirled in blinding patterns, and each step crunched deeply underfoot. The puppy stood at the foot of the porch stairs, shivering so hard its legs buckled. When Mason approached, it didn't growl, it didn't run. It simply watched him, terrified but hopeful, as if this was its final chance at safekeeping. Mason knelt slowly, hands open. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure it was a boy at all. Up close, the animal looked even worse. Its amber-brown eyes were intelligent but clouded with exhaustion. Its black and tan fur was crusted with sleet, and around its neck was something that made Mason's pulse jump. A collar, thick dark leather, smooth and seamless, without a buckle or latch of any kind. It looked manufactured, not bought. A specialized device of some sort. Mason reached out gently. The puppy flinched but didn't bite. When his gloved hand touched the scrap of red fabric, the dog released it with a small, pained whine. Mason lifted the cloth to the porch light. Scorched, torn, and unmistakably familiar. For a moment the storm faded, the cold forgotten, and all he could see was Brian's face, laughing in the break room, cracking bad jokes, tossing him an energy bar before late shift, then screaming behind the locked warehouse door as flames engulfed the building. Mason forced air back into his lungs. He gathered the trembling dog into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, just bones wrapped in shaking fur. "Let's get you warm," he muttered, briskly but gently. Chloe gasped as Mason carried the dog through the door. "Daddy, he's hurt." "I know," Mason said, already lowering the animal onto a thick blanket beside the hearth. The heat from the fire, or what little remained of it, seemed to frighten the dog more than the cold. The moment Mason set it down, the puppy scrambled backward, claws skittering across the wooden floor. It squeezed itself under the table, whining, eyes wide with primal terror. Mason recognized that kind of panic instantly. Trauma. Fire trauma. Something had trapped this pup in heat and smoke before. "It's okay," Mason whispered, moving slowly, palms up. "No one's hurting you." Chloe crouched at his side, her blue eyes wide with compassion. "Is he scared?" "More than scared." Mason's voice tightened. The dog trembled so hard its collar rattled faintly, and that rattling made Mason pause. The collar wasn't leather all the way through. Now that he was closer, he could see a small metallic depression on the underside, a recessed port of some kind. Mason frowned. "That's not a normal collar." Chloe reached for it, but Mason gently held her wrist. "Careful. Let me look first." He retrieved a portable police scanner from his duty bag and swept it over the collar. Instantly, a soft electronic beep pulsed from the scanner, steady, rhythmic, not random, not benign. "What's that mean?" Chloe whispered. Mason's jaw tensed. "It means this thing is transmitting something." The dog whimpered and tried to crawl backward. Mason switched off the scanner and carefully examined the collar seam. No buckle, no latch. Just a continuous band, like those used for high-grade tracking devices. But why on a puppy? And why on a puppy holding Brian's fabric? His mind raced, touch-and-go thoughts circling a single terrifying possibility. Someone put this dog on my doorstep. Someone wants me to follow something. Or someone wants to follow me. Mason exhaled, slow and controlled, then lifted the red scrap again. The charred edge flaked under his fingers, and he turned it over. Then stopped. Embroidered along the hem, faded, half-burned, but unmistakable, were small stitched letters. BR WH12. Brian Whitaker, Evidence Warehouse, Unit 12. Mason's pulse hammered. That fabric hadn't just belonged to his partner. It had come from the burned evidence room, the same one investigators ruled an accident, but Mason never fully believed. Chloe leaned closer. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Mason didn't answer immediately. The storm screamed louder outside, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The dog curled into itself, tail tucked tight, trembling uncontrollably. And Mason, staring at the impossible piece of fabric and the unnatural collar, felt the cabin close in around him, as though the walls themselves recognized danger. Finally, he whispered, "This isn't a coincidence." He looked toward the window, where shadows moved beyond the blowing snow. "And it's not a rescue either. The chapter froze there, uncertainty tightening like a fist around the small cabin on the hill. Morning in Redwood Crest arrived reluctantly, like the sky itself was afraid to disturb whatever secrets the storm had pushed into the Hale household. The blizzard had weakened into a gray, swirling mist that clung to the pine trees and dripped from the icicles hanging along the cabin's eaves. Snow muffled every sound except the restless scratching of branches in the wind, creating a world so quiet it felt as though the mountains were holding their breath. Mason Hale woke early. He hadn't slept much. His mind churned all night with images of the shivering puppy, the burnt scrap of red fabric, and the seamless collar that shouldn't exist on any ordinary dog. He found himself staring at the thing now, as the weak dawn light crept across the wooden floor. The dog, whom Chloe had started calling Frost because of his constant trembling and the snow stuck to his fur, slept curled in a blanket beside the hearth. Even asleep, Frost twitched as though reliving nightmares woven from fire and confinement. Mason crouched beside him, careful not to startle the animal. With one hand, he lifted the portable metal detector he had pulled from his patrol gear. It was a professional-grade device usually reserved for crime scenes, not for analyzing a dog's collar. But nothing about last night felt ordinary. The detector hummed to life, the small screen flickering. Mason slowly waved it over Frost's neck. Instantly, the device emitted a sharp, steady alarm that made the dog jolt awake with a frightened yelp. Mason pulled back. "Easy! Easy there, boy!" Frost scrambled backward, but Chloe appeared behind him like a small ray of color cutting through the storm-muted room. She wore her bright red wool coat again. She always did when she needed courage, and knelt to reassure him. "It's okay, Frost," she whispered, brushing her gloved fingers through his damp fur. "We're not hurting you." Frost's body eased under her touch, the trembling softening. Chloe had a way with frightened creatures that Mason couldn't replicate. She had inherited her mother's gentle instincts. As Chloe continued smoothing Frost's wet fur, Mason lifted the detector again. The alarm had not been a glitch. Whatever was inside the collar was metal-based and powerful. "That collar," Mason murmured. "Someone went through trouble to make it." Chloe looked up. Why would anyone put something like that on a puppy? That was the question, wasn't it? Why the collar? Why Brian's burnt fabric? Why the storm? Mason didn't yet know, but he knew someone had orchestrated this. Breakfast became a quiet affair. Frost refused food at first, until Chloe coaxed him with slow, patient movements. Mason watched them while rubbing the charred fabric between his fingers. The embroidered code, BRWH Hanimsilf, still seemed to burn against his palm. After clearing the small table, Mason grabbed his coat. "We need answers," he said. "I'm going to take a closer look at that collar." Chloe perked up immediately. "Can I help?" Mason hesitated. He usually avoided taking her into anything dangerous. But they were isolated on the ridge, and he didn't want to leave her alone, especially with a storm still muttering outside. "Stay close," he warned, "and keep Frost close too." Chloe nodded solemnly. Her bravery always struck him. It had blossomed from her grief like a rose fighting through frost. As Mason began examining Frost more thoroughly, the dog stiffened. His posture shifted, alert, ears pricking toward the tree line outside the cabin window. "What's wrong, boy?" Mason whispered. Frost let out a single sharp bark, then another. Then he spun, bounding for the door despite his injured leg. "Frost!" Mason lunged, but Chloe was faster, swinging the door open. Frost shot out into the swirling morning fog. "Dad, he's running!" Mason grabbed Chloe's hand and hurried after the dog. The snow was deep, and Frost's prints zigzagged erratically, as though he were fighting an instinct he couldn't control. The trees swallowed the puppy quickly, but they could hear him, barking, urgent, insistent. "What's he doing?" Chloe panted as they climbed the slope behind their home. "Leading us," Mason said, "or trying to." His tone deepened with unease. The storm-battered pines towered above them, their branches heavy with layers of white. Frost disappeared behind a cluster of trunks, barking furiously. When Mason and Chloe caught up, they found the dog at the base of an ancient pine, one of the oldest in Redwood Crest. The bark spiraled upward in gnarled ridges like an old titan holding its ground against centuries of winter. Frost was scratching madly at the snow-packed ground, claws flinging ice and dirt in frantic arcs. "He found something?" Mason said, breath fogging. He knelt, scraping away snow with gloved hands. Just beneath the surface, something metallic glinted. Chloe gasped as Mason unearthed a small metal case, a waterproof, military-style container used to store sensitive materials. It was dented but intact, sealed by clamps. Mason brushed away the frost and flipped it open. Inside were several glass vials of water samples, a stack of damp but legible lab reports, and a USB drive labeled with dates from just weeks before the warehouse fire. Chloe peered over his shoulder, eyes wide. "Dad, this stuff looks important." "It is," Mason murmured. The lab reports bore the insignia of Silver Ridge Industries, the same corporation whose chemical evidence had been stored in the warehouse before it burned down with Brian inside. Mason felt his pulse rise. Too many coincidences. Too many ghosts. As he lifted the USB, Frost suddenly stiffened again. His hackles rose. His ears snapped forward. Mason sensed it too, a vibration in the air, faint but distinct. A low humming approached from above the treetops. "Dad," Chloe whispered, clinging to his sleeve. "What is that?" The sound grew louder, mechanical, rhythmic, not natural. Mason shoved the metal case into his jacket and raised himself to full height. "Stay behind me." Frost planted himself in front of both of them, protectively, despite his trembling leg. Then it appeared, a drone. Not a hobby drone, not the kind neighbors flew on calm weekends. This one was large, matte black, built like a surveillance machine. Its red targeting lights pulsed in deliberate pattern as it hovered above them, slicing through the mist. Mason cursed under his breath. "That's no toy." The drone dipped lower, scanning them with a thin red beam. Frost barked ferociously. Chloe's grip tightened on Mason's coat. "Dad, it's watching us." Mason's mind raced. Someone had put a tracking device on Frost. Someone had sent him carrying evidence. Someone knew exactly where they were now. The drone circled once, slow, cold, calculated. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, it turned and shot back into the forest, disappearing into the swirling mist as if reporting to an unseen master. Frost whined, pressing against Chloe. Mason stared at the sky long after the drone vanished. Nothing about this felt like chance. Nothing felt like an accident. Whoever sent the dog knew exactly what they were doing, and they weren't done yet. The forest around Redwood Crest transformed the moment the drone vanished into the storm-thick air. The wind rose again, snarling through the trees as if it too sensed the shift in danger. Mason tightened his grip on the metal case hidden inside his jacket. Chloe clung to his right arm, while Frost pressed close to her boots, ears pinned back, every muscle quivering. They hurried downhill toward Mason's old silver pickup truck, parked along the tree line. The vehicle was old, but reliable. He kept it tuned himself, but the moment he saw it, a cold dread spread through his chest. Snow had piled thickly against the tires, but even from a distance he could see the damage. All 4 tires were slashed, deep clean cuts through the rubber. Not torn, not chewed by animals, sliced with precision. Someone had been here, someone close. Chloe's breath hitched. "Dad, your truck..." "I see it." Mason forced a calm he didn't feel. He scanned the shadows between the trees, listening. Nothing but the hiss of wind. He knelt and touched one of the gashes. Clean, symmetrical. A knife. Or a tactical blade. Chloe whispered, "Does this mean someone followed us?" Before Mason could answer, a voice cut through the trees, distant but unmistakable, male, sharp, laced with urgency. "Check the dog! It has the collar!" Chloe gasped, grabbing a fistful of Frost's fur. Frost stiffened, his black and tan coat rising in a line of raised hackles from neck to tail. Despite the injury to his hind leg, the young German shepherd stepped in front of Chloe, placing himself between her and the direction of the voices. His jaws parted in a low, guttural growl, an instinctive shield. Mason rose to full height. His first instinct was to fight. 42 years old, strong, trained, with a sidearm on his hip. But the storm muted visibility, and he didn't know how many men were out there, or what weapons they carried. He couldn't risk Chloe. "We're going into the forest," Mason said quietly. Chloe's fingers tightened around Frost's collar. "Dad, it's dark. And going back isn't an option." He took her hand and moved quickly toward the deeper woods. The forest thickened into a tangle of dark trunks and drifting snow. Frost limped beside them, but kept pace, occasionally glancing back, ears twitching at every snapping branch. They pushed through a thicket of frozen brush, Mason moving with the instinct of someone who'd grown up navigating Montana terrain. He knew the shortcuts, the hidden paths, some barely visible, known only to local hunters or to his father, who taught him long before he joined the force. The voices grew more distant, swallowed by the storm. For a moment, Mason believed they were safe. Then they reached the creek. The normally gentle stream had swelled into a raging channel of icy water from melted snow and storm overflow. It rushed violently between slick rocks, churning white foam. "Dad!" Chloe's voice shook. "We can't cross that." "We don't have a choice," Mason said. He scanned the banks quickly, remembering his father's old trail markers. Upstream, the water was narrow but fast. Downstream, broad but shallow. Both were dangerous in different ways. Behind them, the voices returned, louder now, closer. The glow of flashlights flickered through the fog. Mason grabbed Chloe's shoulders. "Sweetheart, stay behind me. Watch my steps." He stepped into the water first. The shock of freezing current ripped through his boots instantly, but he pushed forward. Chloe followed, small and trembling, Frost limping at her side, but refusing to leave her. Halfway across, Mason slipped. It happened too fast to react. The current slammed against his thighs, sweeping his legs from beneath him. He hit the water with a choked gasp, the cold crushing like a fist around his ribs. "Dad!" Chloe screamed. Mason clawed at the water, but the current dragged him, pulling him downstream toward jagged rocks. The storm swallowed everything in white chaos. And then, Frost leapt. For a young dog and one with an injured hind leg, the jump seemed impossible. But Frost's instincts overrode pain. The black and tan shepherd launched himself into the torrent, diving toward Mason with a splash swallowed by the storm. Mason felt something tug sharply at his jacket. Teeth. Frost had latched onto the fabric, growling through the effort, kicking with his uninjured legs to push them both toward the bank. Mason grabbed hold of a half-submerged log and dragged himself up, coughing, gasping for breath. Frost collapsed beside him, drenched, shivering, but alive. Chloe rushed to them, tears streaking her face. "Dad! Frost!" Mason pulled her into a tight embrace, then reached for the dog, running a shaking hand through Frost's wet, black and tan fur. "You saved my life," he whispered to the pup. Frost whimpered softly and nudged his head into Mason's palm. A rustling noise snapped Mason back to alertness. Flashlights cut through the trees again. They had seconds at best. "Into the caves," Mason said. He pointed toward a rocky outcrop rising along the ridge. It was a formation locals called Raven's Teeth. Sharp spires of stone, carved by centuries of snow and wind. At the base was a hollowed gap that led into a shallow cave. Mason helped Chloe climb the rocks. Frost tried to follow, but stumbled, his injured leg buckling. Mason scooped him up and carried him the last few steps, before ducking inside the cave's natural entrance. The air inside was freezing but still, shielded from the storm. The cave floor was dry enough for them to crouch. Mason stripped off his thick winter police jacket, the dark navy fabric stiff with frozen water, and wrapped it around both Chloe and Frost. "Stay warm," he murmured. Frost burrowed into the coat, his fur puffing with each trembling breath. Chloe wrapped her arms around the dog protectively. Mason crouched near the entrance and pulled out his flashlight, but kept the beam pointed downward to prevent detection. Snow filtered in faintly from the cave mouth, glowing pale in the early dusk. Outside, footsteps crunched, harsh voices whispered. One of the flashlight beams slid across the rocks just inches from the cave opening. Chloe held her breath. Frost went still as stone. "You see anything?" a man's voice muttered, deep, irritated. Mason pictured him. Probably mid-30s, local, or outsider. The accent suggested someone from the city. Sharp consonants, clipped vowels. Another voice replied, slightly higher, anxious. "Tracks lead this way. The snow's covering them too fast, though. Find the dog. If we lose that collar, he'll kill us." The beam of light hovered, slid across the snow, then turned away. Their footsteps drifted, fading into the forest. Mason didn't move for several minutes, barely breathing until the storm reclaimed the silence. Chloe finally leaned closer. "Dad, who are they?" Mason stared out into the swirling white void where the men had vanished. "People who want something badly enough to kill for it." He looked down at Frost, the thin, trembling puppy whose collar carried secrets worth surveillance drones and arm trackers. And whatever they want, it starts with him. The cave felt colder suddenly, not because of the snow, but because Mason realized they were in the middle of a game someone else had already planned. A deadly one. And the only clue to surviving it lay in the black and tan puppy pressed against his daughter's chest. The wind had eased by the time Mason, Chloe, and Frost reached the cabin again, but the sky remained low and bruised, heavy with the aftertaste of the storm. Snow crunched under Mason's boots as he approached the front steps, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years. Tonight, they were screaming that danger had followed them home. Chloe clung tightly to Frost, whose black and tan coat was still soaked, his injured hind leg trembling with each step. The little dog's body radiated fear like heat. Every few seconds he would look over his shoulder and growl through clenched teeth, as if something unseen stalked the tree line behind them. Inside the cabin, Mason locked the door and checked the windows. Everything was too quiet. The silence felt wrong, tense, stretched thin. He motioned for Chloe to stay behind the dining table. "Don't move from here," he warned gently. "Hold on to Frost. Keep him calm." Chloe nodded, her blonde hair sticking to her damp scarf, blue eyes wide with fear. Mason grabbed his phone immediately and dialed the one person he trusted outside Redwood Crest, FBI agent Leonard Price. Price was a 38-year-old investigator with a reputation for being calm under pressure, analytical to the point of obsession, and loyal once he trusted someone. He had sharp green eyes narrowed by years of reading crime scenes like novels, light brown hair always tucked under a simple black beanie, and the build of someone who spent his off hours in quiet gyms. Price had worked with Mason on a sting operation years ago, one that nearly cost them both their careers when they uncovered corruption in the sheriff's office. Since then, Price had carried a permanent wariness towards small-town agencies and a deep respect for Mason's integrity. The call connected after 3 rings. "Hale, I was just about to—" "Price, listen carefully," Mason whispered. "Someone attacked us in the woods. They're after the dog. They slashed my tires, chased us through the creek, and I think they tracked us back to the cabin." There was a pause, then Price's voice sharpened. "All business. Teams on standby, but the storm shut down 2 access roads. We're still 3 to 4 hours out." Mason's pulse spiked. "We might not have that long. Keep the evidence. Do not confront them unless you have to." "Price, they're already here," Mason hissed. Before the agent could answer, the cabin lights flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed the room. Chloe whimpered. Frost barked sharply, ears flat against his skull. Mason dropped the phone and moved by instinct, grabbing his flashlight from his duty belt and clicking it on. The beam cut through the dark just long enough for him to glimpse movement outside the windows, shadows darting, circling, testing each side of the cabin. Then came the footsteps, crunching snow. At least 4 men, maybe more, surrounding the house in a loose ring, slow, deliberate, confident. Mason switched off the flashlight and herded Chloe and Frost toward the hallway. "Stay behind me." A faint clink sounded against the far window. Then something smashed through the glass. A glass bottle, stuffed with cloth, hit the wooden floor and exploded into flame. A Molotov cocktail. Fire roared instantly, dancing greedily across the dry wood. The flames reflected off Frost's black and tan coat, turning his trembling body into a flickering silhouette of panic. The dog bolted behind the sofa, barking hysterically, scraping the floor with frantic paws. "Dad!" Chloe cried. "The fire—" "I know!" Mason grabbed the nearest heavy coat and slammed it over the growing flames, trying to suffocate them, but another Molotov came crashing through the opposite window. Fire raced like serpents across the boards, creeping toward the curtains, the sofa, the front door. Voices outside shouted to one another, muffled by the storm. One voice rose above the rest, sharp, commanding. "Move in after the fire spreads! Don't let them escape!" Frost, terrified by the heat and memories of whatever fire he had survived before, darted toward the hallway. Mason turned, too late to stop him. The young dog's instincts drove him into the bedroom, tail tucked, scrambling under the bed where the shadows felt safe. "No, Frost!" Chloe cried, running after him. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. Fire licked across the walls. Mason grabbed Chloe before she could enter the burning hallway. "You can't go in there. It's too hot." "But Frost is stuck." Frost's whimpers echoed from beneath the bed, muffled by the rolling smoke. Mason took one breath, deep, steady, determined. He had lost Brian. He had lost his wife. He would not lose Chloe. He would not lose this dog, who had already saved them twice. "Stay low," he ordered Chloe, "and stay behind the sofa where the smoke is thinner. Do not move until I come back." Chloe nodded, sobbing silently, clutching her red coat tight as her father turned and ran into the thickening smoke. Heat slammed into Mason like an open furnace. The hallway was nearly swallowed by flames crawling up the walls. He dropped to his knees, crawling through the burning corridor. Frost's cries led him toward the bedroom, even as the fire grew louder, a beast feeding on the wooden frame. Mason reached the doorway, shielding his face with his arm. The bedroom was half lit by flames devouring the left wall. Frost was jammed under the bed, trembling violently, unable to move past the fear that fire had carved deep into his instincts. "It's okay, boy," Mason shouted hoarsely. "I'm here." He reached under the bed, grabbed Frost by the collar, and yanked hard. The puppy slid out, claws scrambling against the floorboards. Mason tucked him under one arm, rose, and shoved through the burning doorway. The flames singed his uniform and seared the exposed skin of his forearm. He didn't stop. Chloe cried out as he burst into the living room, smoke rising around him like black ghosts. Mason staggered toward the nearest intact window. "Move back!" he warned. He kicked once, twice. The third kick shattered the glass. Cold air blasted inside. He held Frost close to his chest and hurled the dog outward into the snow. Frost landed clumsily, rolling once, but immediately rose shakily to his feet, barking for Mason to follow. "Dad, jump!" Chloe screamed. Mason climbed onto the windowsill, just as a shadow stepped into view. A gun barrel pressed between Mason's eyes. Victor Crane. Crane stood tall, broad-shouldered, around 45, with a face of sharp angles carved in winter stone. His gray eyes glinted with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally cornered his prey. He wore a heavy black tactical jacket dusted with snow, black cargo pants, and gloves gripping a matte black pistol. "Give me the USB," Crane said, his voice low, deadly, calm, "or your daughter watches you fall." Mason's breath froze in his throat. The USB was in his jacket pocket, the one he had used to shield Chloe. He didn't move. Behind Crane, two men flanked the cabin, scanning aggressively. Chloe sobbed from outside. "Dad, come on!" Frost barked wildly, the black and tan fur around his tail singed from the flames. He lunged forward, but his injured leg buckled, sending him sliding in the snow. Crane didn't look at the dog. His finger tightened on the trigger. Just as the gunshot cracked through the cold air, another gunshot answered. A single precise bullet struck Crane's weapon, shattering it from his grip. He recoiled in shock, clutching his hand. "Federal agents!" a voice shouted from the trees. "Drop your weapons!" Agent Leonard Price emerged with two FBI tactical officers, all in black winter gear, with yellow FBI lettering, rifles raised. Price's green eyes burned with controlled fury. Crane lunged for a backup knife, but the agents were faster. They tackled him into the snow, wrenching his arms behind his back. Mason finally leapt from the burning window, collapsing into the snow beside Chloe. She threw her arms around him, sobbing with relief. Frost limped forward, pressing his head under Chloe's arm, whining softly. "Dad, I thought Frost burned. I thought we lost him," Chloe whispered. Mason pulled them both close, his breath shaking in the cold. "He's tougher than he looks," he murmured, "and so are you." The cabin behind them roared with fire, lighting the forest like a pyre. But for the first time in hours, Mason felt the balance shift, not in favor of the hunters, but the hunted. Tonight, they survived, but the war was far from over. 4 months passed, and the brutal winter that once swallowed Redwood Crest had finally loosened its grip. Spring returned cautiously at first, thin shafts of sunlight filtering between the pines, the snow melting in hesitant patches. But as days warmed, the mountain town began to breathe again. What had once been a place marked by fear and fire was now slowly repainting itself in softer colors, green shoots pushing through thawed soil, the smell of rain replacing the sting of ice, and the murmur of townsfolk walking freely without glancing over their shoulders. The courtroom battle against Silver Ridge Industries had been long, exhausting, and ruthless. But justice, slow as it was, had found its way through. The evidence Mason and Chloe uncovered, the metal case Frost dug up, the water samples, the USB drive, the secrecy embedded in the collar, had unraveled an entire chain of corruption. Executives, security heads, falsified lab technicians, all of them had been pulled into the light. And though the trial pushed Mason into a spotlight he never asked for, he faced it with the same calm determination he carried through every storm. Now, in late April, Mason stood in front of a newly built cabin, one designed not just to replace what had been lost, but to symbolize a future he finally allowed himself to imagine. The new house was sturdier, with reinforced walls, a stone chimney, and wide windows overlooking the valley. The old place had been filled with memories, some beautiful, some painful. This one represented healing. Frost bounded across the front yard, no longer the emaciated, trembling puppy who collapsed at their doorstep 4 months earlier. He had grown taller, broader in the chest, with muscles visible under his sleek black and tan coat. His fur shimmered in the spring light, clean, glossy, and no longer matted by fear. His hind leg, once swollen and wounded, had healed with only the slightest limp during long runs, but even that rarely slowed him down. At roughly 1 year old now, Frost had become everything Mason hoped for: strong, loyal, fiercely protective, and deeply bonded with Chloe. Chloe herself had changed too. She had regained the radiance that grief once dimmed. Her blonde waves bounced freely as she chased Frost around the yard in her bright red coat. She still wore it, though not from fear anymore, but because she believed Frost liked the color. Her laughter filled the air the way birdsong filled the pines. Watching her now, Mason felt something inside him settle, something that had been restless since the night of the warehouse fire. By mid-morning, sunlight broke through the branches in wide golden beams. Mason called out, "Chloe, Frost, ready to go?" Chloe ran toward him, cheeks flushed pink from running. Frost trotted behind her, large paws pounding the ground with youthful rhythm. Mason loaded a small bag into the pickup truck. His truck had been repaired and upgraded with reinforced tires and new headlights, and opened the passenger door for Chloe. Frost jumped into the back seat with practiced ease, tail thumping against the seat. They drove through the winding mountain road, past the creek that had nearly taken Mason's life, past the Raven's Teeth Rock Formation, past the place where snow still lingered like stubborn ghosts of winter. The forest was a patchwork of melting ice and fresh green needles, sparkling under a soft sun. Their destination sat at the base of a ridge, a memorial garden built by the town to honor first responders who lost their lives in service. At its center was a stone monument with brass plaques, one of which bore the name Brian Whitaker. Brian had been more than a partner to Mason. He had been a brother in everything but blood, loyal, stubborn, fearless, and known for his crooked grin and habit of tapping his badge when trying to make a point. The fire that killed him had left a hole in the department, but an even deeper one in Mason's heart. Mason parked beside the garden, helping Chloe out of the truck. Frost leapt out behind them, sniffing the air and wagging his tail gently, as if sensing the meaning of this place. They approached Brian's memorial. The stone was cool under the shade of towering pines. A small arrangement of fresh flowers rested at its base, left by someone earlier that morning. Mason knelt, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a USB drive, an empty one, identical to the original. He placed it gently on the plaque. "I've finished the work you left behind," Mason whispered. His voice steadied but held tremors of memory. "I couldn't save you then, but your truth saved us now." Chloe knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around Frost's neck. The dog leaned into her warmly, pressing his head under her chin. Chloe stroked his black and tan fur with soft, tender fingers. "Dad," she said softly, "I feel safe now, because Frost is here, because we're together." Mason rested a hand on her back. "You two saved me more than you'll ever know." Just then, a figure approached along the path. Agent Leonard Price emerged from behind the line of pines, dressed casually in a dark green jacket and jeans, a welcome change from his usual tactical attire. His green eyes softened when he saw the two of them. "Hail!" he greeted. "Didn't expect to see you here so early." Mason stood and shook his hand. "Thought it was time." Price nodded. He glanced at Frost. "And how's our hero?" Frost wagged his tail, stepping forward to sniff Price's hand. Price chuckled quietly, a rare warmth glowing through his usually reserved demeanor. "He looks strong, healthier than half my team." "That's Chloe's doing," Mason said. "She practically adopted him on day one." Chloe grinned proudly. "He's my best friend." As the three adults spoke, Frost trotted toward a patch of sunlight, chasing drifting petals blown from a nearby flowering shrub. Chloe ran after him, giggling. They played together under the bright, clear sky, weaving between the trees like two small spirits finally free from fear. Price leaned closer to Mason. "You did good, Hale, not just with the case, with your daughter, with rebuilding all this." Mason exhaled slowly. The morning breeze carried the scent of thawing earth and pine needles. "For a long time, I didn't think I could put the pieces back together. And now?" Mason looked at Chloe and Frost, her red coat glowing like a beacon of life, Frost's black and tan fur shining like a flame resurrected from ashes. "Now," Mason said, "we're a family again. Maybe for the first time since everything happened." Price rested a hand on his shoulder. "Then this is a new start." The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the memorial garden. Frost ran in wide, joyful circles, Chloe chasing after him, and for the first time in years, Mason let himself smile, freely, fully, without the weight of sorrow pressing it down. He whispered almost to himself, "A new dawn." As Frost bounded past him, the sunlight caught his coat, illuminating the black and tan fur in a warm, fiery shimmer. It reminded Mason of a rising ember, alive, resilient, a testament to survival, a symbol of hope and of rebirth. Redwood Crest was quiet, peaceful, safe once more, and this time, nothing would tear their family apart again. In the end, the story of Mason, Chloe, and Frost reminds us of something powerful. Even in the deepest winter storms of our lives, when we feel lost or afraid or unsure of what comes next, God can send help in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes that help arrives as a person, sometimes as a moment of mercy, and sometimes, just like Frost, it arrives as a small miracle with 4 paws and a beating heart. We do not always see God's plan in the moment, but looking back, we often realize how every hardship, every tear, and every act of courage shaped the path that led us to safety, healing, and hope. Mason thought he was saving a frightened puppy, yet God used that puppy to save him, his daughter, and an entire town. It is a reminder that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and no life is too small for God to work through. As you go through your own days, may this story remind you to stay strong, stay kind, and listen closely to the quiet signs of grace around you. God is still writing miracles into ordinary moments, and sometimes those miracles look just like a little girl in a red coat and a loyal dog chasing sunlight through the trees. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us how God has worked in your life, or simply write Amen to stand in faith with this beautiful reminder of hope. And if you enjoyed this journey, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so more people can hear stories that warm the heart and lift the spirit. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide you through every storm you face. Amen.